Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're here to discuss one of the most persistent myths in the polyglot community, i.e. the assumption that just because we're polyglots, it means we're necessarily more tolerant.
So are polyglots more tolerant? Well, let's find out. I've broken down this presentation into 4 different parts. The first of which is, what is actually tolerance? What are we talking about when we speak about this concept? Number 2, arguments and evidence in favor of the assumption that polyglots are more tolerant than monolinguals. Number 3, arguments and evidence against the assumption that polyglots are more tolerant. And finally, my conclusion. Now, first things first, what is tolerance? The scholarly literature typically distinguishes between 2 different types of tolerance, which is not to say these 2 types are unrelated. As a matter of fact, they aren't. They are connected. Now, the first type of tolerance is cognitive tolerance. This is the tolerance of ambiguity, or our ability to feel comfortable in a new environment when we don't yet understand everything that surrounds us. So people who have a high cognitive tolerance feel excited rather than frightened in unfamiliar situations. And then we have cultural tolerance, which is the ability to function effectively in different cultures, to think and act in an appropriate fashion, and to communicate and work with people from different cultural backgrounds, whether it is at home or abroad. Now, as you can see, these 2 types are fairly connected, because new environments can mean new cultures. Unfamiliar situations might mean meeting people from different backgrounds. So what is the evidence in favor of the idea that polyglots are more tolerant than monolinguals? First of all, there is conclusive evidence that learning languages helps develop tolerance ambiguity, that multilinguals are more at ease when dealing with ambiguity. So this is the type of cognitive tolerance we spoke about. For instance, we have this article entitled, "Is Multilingualism Linked to a Higher Tolerance of Ambiguity?" published in 2012 by Jean-Marc Dewaele and Li Wei in the journal Bilingualism, Language and Cognition. And as you can see on the abstract, the authors claim that their findings show that a high level of multilingualism makes individuals more at ease in dealing with ambiguity. They also recognize later on that a higher level of tolerance of ambiguity can also strengthen in turn an individual's inclination to become multilingual. So it goes both ways, but there is, as I said, conclusive evidence that being multilingual makes individuals more at ease in dealing with ambiguity, i.e. it increases people's cognitive tolerance. Now, in addition to this, there is also proof that learning languages helps fight cultural stereotypes. So when students learn another language, they actually develop alternative ways of understanding culture through the critical analysis of cultural stereotypes. As you can see on the screen, this has been demonstrated in the article "I Had a Stereotype That Americans Were Fat, Becoming Speaker of Culture in a Second Language." The authors, Nguyen and Kellogg, claim that, and I quote, "Our analysis demonstrates concretely that learning a second language involves the acquisition not only of linguistic forms, but also ways of thinking and behaving in new communities of practice." So there you go. This is proof that being multilingual, speaking many languages, does increase our cultural awareness and therefore our tolerance in a cultural sense. Now, so far we've seen studies on how multilingualism increases cognitive tolerance on the one hand, and how it increases cultural tolerance on the other. But on top of this, there are also studies where both cognitive and cultural tolerance have been tested at the same time, and in that case it was also found that multilingualism increased both. For instance, in the article Multilingualism and Outgroup Acceptance, the mediating roles of cognitive flexibility and deprovincialization. So cognitive flexibility will make reference to that kind of cognitive tolerance, whereas deprovincialization speaks to cultural tolerance. And as you can see, the authors Kieran Douglas Mepham and Borja Martinovic conclude, on the basis of their cross-sectional survey data among a representative sample of native Dutch participants from the Netherlands, that multilingualism is an important yet understudied factor in social psychological research on prejudice reduction. You can find further discussion of these and other studies in the blog entry How Learning a New Language Improves Tolerance by Amy Thompson, Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of South Florida. So all in all, we have conclusive evidence that multilingualism increases both cognitive and cultural tolerance. But if this is true, then what is the evidence against the assumption that multilinguals and polyglots are more tolerant than monolinguals? Well, let's find out. First, multilingualism and polyglottia are different from plurilingualism. And so multilingualism or polyglottia is the ability to speak many languages. Now, these terms, multilingualism and polyglottia, are not exactly the same, and you can see the difference in the video whose link you can find on top of the screen. But for the purpose of this presentation, we will treat them interchangeably. And so both multilingualism and polyglottia refer to the ability to speak many languages. However, in contradistinction to this, plurilingualism is not only the ability to speak many languages, but also the intercultural competence and democratic citizenship that builds on that ability to speak many languages. In other words, if you just speak many languages, you are multilingual, you're a polyglot, you're not necessarily a plurilingual individual. For you to be a plurilingual individual, you need to couple that with the development of your intercultural competence and education in democratic citizenship values. You can see this explained in a blog post by Dr. Sarah Eileen Eaton, professor and ethicist. She defines plurilingualism as the capacity and competence to learn more than one language, as well as the value of linguistic tolerance within individuals and countries. It is associated with intercultural competence and democratic citizenship. This term is often used to talk about language education and policy. It says for more details, see the Council of Europe source reference below. And when we go to that reference, we find the document From Linguistic Diversity to Plurilingual Education, Guide for the Development of Language Education Policies in Europe. Now it's interesting to observe in the general conclusion that this guide, and I quote, is not so much a matter of promoting language diversity as placing citizens as language users at the center in order to give impetus to their professional lives, ensure social integration and recognition by cultural and social communities other than those with which they themselves identify. In other words, the crucial social function of language education policies based on the principle of plurilingualism as a fundamental value of democratic tolerance and a specific competence to be developed is counteract linguistic denigration and intolerance in order to bring about democratic fraternity and peace. Now, this paragraph is a bit convoluted, but let me give you some clear examples that show that just because one has the ability to speak many languages, he or she still needs to develop intercultural competence and democratic citizenship values in order to be tolerant. For instance, Take the proverbial spy that speaks many languages, but that uses that ability to speak many languages to spy on another culture, invading the privacy and the secrecy of information from another person, country, organization, etc. Or consider these four individuals. The one on the left is Hermann Göring, who spoke fluent English, school French, and some Swedish. To his right, we find Albert Speer, who spoke French and English. To the right of Albert Speer, we find Rudolf Hess, who spoke passable English. And then, on the right side, we find Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was fully fluent in French and English. What do they all have in common? They're polyglots. What else do they have in common? They're members of the German National Socialist Party. They are Nazis. Not precisely the epitome of tolerance. So these are four individuals who speak several languages that nonetheless are not only not tolerant, but are actually the utmost example of intolerance, proving that one can speak many languages and still be very intolerant. Now, the second issue against the assumption that polyglots are more tolerant than monolinguals is the notion of intolerance. Here there are two arguments. One, the paradox of tolerance, the idea that we cannot afford to tolerate those who are intolerant. Therefore, we have to be intolerant at some point, even as tolerant individuals. And the fact that some individuals within the polyglot community spread negative ideas, amongst which hatred against non-polyglots, against monolingual individuals, therefore showing intolerance towards them rather than tolerance. And so, first of all, the paradox of tolerance. This is an idea developed by philosopher of science Karl Popper in his book The Open Society and Its Enemies. So as you can see on the screen, the question that Popper poses is, should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? The answer is no. Popper claims that unlimited tolerance can lead to the extinction of tolerance. If you tolerate everybody, including the Nazis, they will end up killing you, and therefore they will kill tolerance. When we extend tolerance to those who are openly intolerant, the tolerant ones end up being destroyed, and tolerance with them. Any movement that preaches intolerance and persecution must be outside of the law, must not be tolerated. So, Popper concludes, as paradoxical as it may seem, defending tolerance requires to not tolerate the intolerant. So there you go, even the most tolerant individuals, as part of that tolerance, in the name of that tolerance, cannot afford to tolerate everybody. And on top of this, as I said, some individuals in the polyglot community express a negative judgment of monolinguals. This, of course, is a facetious meme. You wouldn't understand, you filthy monolingual. It's tongue-in-cheek, yes, but it contains a kernel of truth, i.e. the idea that some polyglots do not feel comfortable surrounded by monolinguals and have a hard time tolerating their monolingualism, which is of course a form of intolerance. And I'm sure you can think of other expressions such as, oh, I just made a mistake in this language, but it's because I speak many more than you. If only you had the ability to speak many languages, then you would understand, but I guess you wouldn't because you don't speak many languages at the end of the day. Well, that sort of thinking is at the root of the intolerance that some polyglots express towards people who don't share that ability to speak many languages. And let us remember that this is not always a choice. Some people do not have the financial means or the time availability to learn several languages, and we shouldn't blame them for that. And finally, the third reason why polyglot does not necessarily mean more tolerant is that within the polyglot community, individuals often inadvertently reproduce prejudices that have to do with colonialism and racism. For instance, native speakerism, i.e. the linguistic ideology that so-called native speakers and so-called non-native speakers are individuals out there, are empirically verifiable, are objective realities rather than socioculturally constructed categories. And the associated belief that those quote-unquote native speakers are necessarily the model of competence, the ideal speaker-listener of their first language, which is of course not true. People who express themselves in their first language oftentimes do not have a C2 level in that language unless they are highly educated, and on top of that they are worse at spotting mistakes that people who learn that language as their second, third, etc. language are more used to identifying. Of course, the idea of native versus non-native is rooted in 17th and 18th processes of colonialism and nationalism, as I have explained in the video whose link you can find on top of the screen. Second is the idea of accentism. It's also a language ideology according to which some people have an accent and some people don't. The people that have an accent are the so-called non-native speakers, whereas the people who learn that language as their first language cannot possibly have an accent. Of course, this idea is incorrect and dangerously so, as I have demonstrated in the video whose link you can find on top of the screen. Everybody has an accent, and speaking without an accent will be the equivalent of typing without a font. Number 3, the idea that flags represent languages. Of course, flags do not represent languages, as many languages are spoken within the same country, and flags oftentimes stand for countries, with the exception of perhaps the flag for Esperanto and the likes of that. Again, you can find the whole explanation in the link which is now appearing on top of the screen. And finally, the idea that some languages are foreign. Now, of course, the idea of foreignness is an othering idea, is an idea that creates a separation, a division between some type of people and some other type of people, i.e. locals and foreigners, which does not help building an inclusive society. The idea that some languages are foreign in absolute terms does not make any sense, because being foreign is always relative to some nation or another. And so it's a label that creates division rather than inclusion, which is why in the video whose link you can see on top of the screen, I suggest we speak of world languages instead of foreign languages. However, these prejudices that I'm denouncing here, native speakerism, accentism, the presupposition that flags represent languages, and the assumption that some languages are quote-unquote foreign, are still very much ingrained in the everyday discourse of the polyglot community, which is why most polyglot communities, perhaps inadvertently without realizing they're doing it, are actually reproducing forms of intolerance. This happens even in academia, even in the scientific community. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the article I just quoted at the beginning of the presentation, as you can see on the screen, the authors say the following, and I quote, "Empirical studies have shown that learning a foreign language is related to reduced prejudice toward native speakers of that particular language." This is a phenomenal example of that clash between the language of tolerance and the categories of language intolerance. So the authors are using the colonial and nationalist categories of foreign language and native speakers to speak about how tolerant multilingual people are, to speak about how multilingualism reduces prejudice. And we find kind of the same contradiction in yet another article that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The author says, and I quote, "My research on motivation, anxiety, and beliefs indicates that language learning improves people's tolerance of ambiguity, especially when more than one foreign language is involved." Again, we're using the categories of intolerance to speak about how multilingualism enhances people's tolerance, in this case tolerance of ambiguity. So in conclusion, When it comes to polyglots and tolerance, we need to remember that correlation is not causation. On the one hand, a positive correlation has been shown to exist between polyglossia and tolerance, both cognitive and cultural. On the other, however, tolerance necessitates from intolerance towards the intolerant, as shown in Popper's paradox of tolerance. Polyglots can use and have used their linguistic ability to further intolerant purposes, as I demonstrated with the examples of the Nazis and some spies. And the very vocabulary in which polyglots express themselves on a daily basis is still very much ingrained in colonial and racist forms of prejudice, including native speakerism, accentism, and foreignness. As a result, and in conclusion, nowadays polyglossia implies a sort of an odd combination of tolerance and, mostly unintended but not always, intolerance.
So that's all from me. I hope that much is clear, that yes, polyglots have a tendency to be more tolerant when it comes to cognitive and cultural issues, but at the same time, that does not exonerate them from being intolerant, be it consciously or inadvertently. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thanks for watching.